Hello, everyone. This is Ashley Brooks, and I am going to be presenting on the biopsychosocial implications of racism and poverty on Black children from conception to adulthood. A little bit about me in case you all haven't seen my other um, presentation. I am currently a CSW licensed in Kentucky. I am currently also under supervision so that I can, earn my hours and hopefully sit for my LCSW exam so that I can be fully licensed like many of you lovely people. I currently provide therapy as a contract therapist with a local organization. Um, I provide individual therapy for adults. I have interest in bariatric patients. I'm a bariatric patient myself. That's what my last presentation was on. Adults with history of substance use and extensive trauma. I'm currently a medical social worker. I work in a couple of hospitals. I kind of work at my main hospital and I work on their behalf as a liaison at one of the other ones in their emergency psych departments. So I have a lot of hands-on with folks that are in crisis. My interests as far as topics generally are, very wide. Of course, they encompass medical social work, bariatric patients, interdisciplinary research on how racism and other societal factors affect communities of colors as well. Today, we will go by this agenda. I hopefully will not have a lot of going back and forth. Sometimes I kind of think of things a little after I pass up the subject. We're going to start with the introduction. Then we're going to go into the psychological and developmental impact of racism and poverty. Then go into the impact of racism and poverty on health outcomes. Talk a little bit about future research and end with a conclusion, just some final thoughts. All right, let's start with the introduction. Let's talk a little bit about racism. What is racism? According to the Oxford Dictionary, racism is described as prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism by an individual, community, or institution against a person or people on the basis of their membership in a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is a minority or marginalized. Structural racism, which is something we'll touch on in this presentation, in turn is described as the totality of ways in which societies foster racial discrimination through mutually reinforcing systems of housing, education, employment, earnings, benefits, credit, media, healthcare, and criminal justice. These patterns and practices in turn reinforce discriminatory beliefs, values, and distribution of resources. Structural racism, some people use structural racism and systematic racism kind of interchangeably, but there are many people who kind of keep them separate. So systemic racism to a lot of folks kind of encompasses all the types of racism. So the internalized, the interpersonal, the structural, the institutional, and the individual racism, right? So that system creates racism and tries to perpetualize it and reinforce it with the other, I would say, more micro and macro, right, types of racism. So the institutional, the individual, right? So, and in turn, they also reinforce the systematic racism. So it's certainly a unfortunate cycle, right? One of the things that we will be talking about a bit in this presentation is redlining. So Um, that is considered kind of like a structural racism um, tool of sorts, right? Redlining is an illegal practice that involves denying or limiting financial services to specific neighborhoods based on the race, color, national origin, or other prohibited characteristic of the residents. It can include unequal access to credit or unequal terms of credit. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that entails in a few slides. Redlining was significantly um, associated with higher levels of discrimination, and that discrimination was significantly and positively associated with anxiety, depressive symptoms, and perceived stress scores. Um, One of the things that was stressed in research is that people overwhelmingly, 8 out of 10 Black people say that they have personally experienced discrimination because of their race or ethnicity. So um, it's about 79–80% of Black people. And it's really unfortunate because for many, it seems like in some way, shape, or form, they can experience it daily, something that is um, very frequent, right? And racism and the systems that uphold it, right, um, can be very harmful to people's mental health and physical health. I want to take a couple of minutes just to kind of go over structural racism a little bit more. So I want to kind of touch on structural racism and the myth of meritocracy. Public discourse has been largely shaped by a narrative of meritocracy, which is laced with ideals of opportunity without any consideration of the realities of racism and race-based inequalities. Race is a major determinant of socioeconomic status, or SES, in the United States. Therefore, it's not surprising that the successful implementation of discriminatory race-based policies premised on racial inferiority would produce racial disparity. The term or the definition of um, structural racism is essentially used to capture the ways in which any inequities are perpetuated through the racialized differential access to quality resources, opportunities, and services that are codified in our laws, policies, practices, and societal norms. One of the things that I found during my research was um, the WHO, the World Health Organization, actually identified 3 key tenets to improving health at a global level that each reinforce the impact of socioeconomic factors. One would be to improve the conditions of daily life, so people being able to afford their daily needs, right? So feeling safe. So, just kind of thinking of the basics of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So, you feel safe, you have shelter, you have food, those types of things, right? And being able to feel safe in your space, right? 2 would be to tackle the inequitable distribution of power, money, and resources, the structural drivers of those conditions of daily life globally, nationally, and locally. So, focusing on creating equity, right? Because equality and equity are different, right? So, equality is, giving people the same amount, right? But equity takes in account for, okay, this person is more disadvantaged, so they might need more, right? To be able to be at the, I guess, kind of at a equitable point as, one of their peers, for example. And lastly, three is to develop a workforce trained in the social determinants of health and raise public awareness about social needs and the social determinants of health. Social factors and health behaviors have contributed substantially to the growing non-communicable disease epidemics. Um, Pervasive public policy spanning from, essentially like slavery to present day, where we might see, voter suppression, right? Like we still have instances of things like that occurring. Have and continue to severely limit opportunities for social mobility among marginalized groups, which perpetuates and which perpetuates the inequalities in power, status, and resources that define our essentially our racial caste system and structure in the United States. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about redlining here. So the term redlining originated in the 1930s when the fund lenders would draw red lines, literal red lines, on maps to mark areas they would avoid. So again, this began in the 1930s, and it was actually part of a federal housing policy to encourage home ownership and help the economy recover from the Great Depression. Um, the redlining policies, right, made it difficult for Black households and other communities of color to access home mortgages and become homeowners. Studies show that Black and Hispanic borrowers are more likely to be denied mortgages or to be offered higher priced mortgages than similar white borrowers, and that interest rates paid by these minority borrowers are especially high in neighborhoods with a large share of minority residents. Total housing equity wealth actually fell by over 70% for Hispanic households during this time, and 53% for Black households, compared to the 41% for white households. So even though everyone was, kind of suffering at this point in time, right? The communities of color still suffered a lot more than their white counterparts. Throughout U.S. history, white property owners have fueled segregation and unequal access to opportunity by working through local governments to enhance their own resources and access to public benefits. There is something called municipal fragmentation. So essentially, this allows hyperlocal exclusionary zoning. And zoning regulations such as density restrictions. So a density restriction, for example, would be limits to the construction of multi-family housing, for example. So this correlates highly with economic and racial slash ethnic segregation and concentration of affluent households. Restrictive zoning is one of the most powerful current methods by which opportunity is hoarded into exclusionary enclaves and segregation is reinforced and perpetuated. So although the practice of redlining has been quote unquote illegal since 1968, multiple studies show that redlining's harmful legacy has left non-white communities struggling with air pollution, reproductive health disorders, and fewer urban amenities more than 50 years later. Discriminatory practices like, restrictive zoning and redlining as a whole have maintained housing segregation, neighborhood wealth gaps, and other inequities between white families and Black and Hispanic families. So, there are technically no, laws, right? But there are still things like restrictive zoning that are kind of still occurring currently. Redlining and health implications. Residents in Previously, degraded neighborhoods lived in proximity to nearly twice the density of oil and gas wells as those in formerly A-graded areas. So during the redlining process, um, when they were drawing essentially the lines on the map, right, they were categorizing the neighborhoods. So essentially, neighborhoods were given grades. So degraded neighborhoods were areas that were considered hazardous by the homeowners loan corporation, and they were the areas that were marked in red on the maps. The A-graded neighborhoods are essentially going to be the ones that are more concentrated with the white population, right? With the white, probably, pretty wealthy, right? So they certainly on those maps, if you happen to look one up, kind of like the one that was in the previous slide, that one was actually of my hometown, and you'll see different zones in different colors. So that's essentially what those were showing you, those different zones and things of that nature. Living near oil and gas wells actually exposes residents to numerous pollutants that can cause issues like cardiovascular disease, impaired lung function, anxiety, depression, and preterm birth. And those are going to be some things we'll talk a little bit more about as well. Research has shown that 60% of previously degraded communities remain non-white, and that people of color are disproportionately exposed to greater levels of air pollution despite the overall improvements of air quality across the country. So there is still a concentration. There is still issues of, although there are improvements of air quality and probably more policies and rules when it comes to especially like companies and pollutants and things, right? The communities of color are still to this day exposed to greater levels of air pollution. So some of the things that they do experience, according to research, is having worse air, worse water, and more noise pollution than their white counterparts. In addition, there's generally also less green space, right? So there is in a lot of the more impoverished neighborhoods, you're not going to see a lot of parks, trees, gardens. You're not going to have as much green space as you would in some of the other more affluent areas. It's shown that access to green space in urban areas can potentially help with reducing stress and improve well-being. A lot of more impoverished areas have a lack of green space and a lot more roads and sidewalks and buildings, factories, things like that, and not so much spaces that are green. There's sometimes you'll see a lot of other things, like you might see that maybe the area is less taken care of compared to affluent areas. So you might see abandoned homes, and you might see more liquor stores, and less places that you can get maybe fresh fruit and vegetables, and things like that, unfortunately. Present-day disparities in U.S. urban pollution levels reflect a legacy of structural racism in federal policymaking and resulting investment flows and land use decisions by the decision makers. And this is apparent in redlining maps that were drawn more than 80 years ago. So although it's not technically, being practiced or legal, right? The simple fact is that nothing has really changed much. Poverty, right? So this is one of the public health issues, quite frankly, because it is one of the public health issues that affects so many people in this country and honestly around the world. Poverty is defined, or refers to rather, the state or condition in which people or communities lack the financial resources and other essentials for a minimum standard of living. As such, they cannot meet their basic needs. So, um, impoverished people may have issues with, you know, stable housing, with getting food that is, healthy for them. Um, Things of that nature, and having quality access to things like healthcare and food and transportation, as well. Poverty is multidimensional. It's so complex because it is affected by so many things, and it causes, so many issues for in so many parts of folks' lives. Children of color are a minority in this country, yet they account for a large portion of children who live in poverty. According to research, nearly 1 in 6 children were poor in 2021, according um, to the 2023 Children's Defense Fund report. So, of that, about 1 in 3 Black and American Indian or Alaskan Native children and 1 in 4 Hispanic children were poor, compared to 1 in 9 white children. So, essentially, the report estimates about 72% of impoverished children were children of color. Children are the poorest age group in America. However, children of color are disproportionately poorer than their white counterparts. Children are impoverished because their families are impoverished. Um, so we have to really look at, okay, why is, this family impoverished, right? To really address child poverty. And that'll, lead you into, okay, what policies and what societal factors and what is causing um, the rates of poverty, especially in children of color, in families of color. And then, you look at the systems and you look at the policies and all of these things are so ingrained in our societies. Stress-induced poverty, stress induced by by poverty rather, has been shown to have negative effects on children, especially children of color. Stress induced by poverty can negatively affect brain development and behavior. Some of these effects can happen before the child is even born in utero. Stress induced by poverty has been shown to have negative effects on children, especially children of color, unfortunately. And that's going to be something we'll kind of touch on as we go further into the presentation as well. Because of the multidimensional stressors of poverty and race, Black children are more at risk in the prenatal period than their prenatal period than their white counterparts. During the prenatal period, so before they're born, the child will experience what the mother experiences. So the stressors that are caused by poverty can make the mom produce stress hormones, and constantly being exposed to those can be detrimental to health outcomes and have been linked to some negative health outcomes that affect children throughout their lives. There also is a connection with poverty and race and infant mortality rates and low birth rates. African American mothers not only are affected by the stress associated with poverty, they're also affected by the stress associated with living in a racist society. There will be a term that we'll we'll talk about briefly called weathering as we get to this section about maternal health. So there is a intersectional relationship between race and poverty. Research has shown that SES is correlated with poverty. So SES encompasses income as well as educational attainment, social status, and social class. Low SES is correlated with lower educational achievement, poverty, and poorer health. So on an individual scale, this can affect mental and physical health. There are, inequalities in quality access to healthcare, resource distribution, and overall quality of life that are associated with poverty. Excuse me. Children of color are disproportionately poorer, again, because their families are poorer, because their communities are poorer. And throughout looking at the policies and looking at the history of this country and the treatment of Black communities and communities of color, this is certainly not something that's accidental, especially as things are still trying to be upheld today. Like it seems like there is still such pushback towards policy that tries to address the inequities that have been going on for hundreds of years. Data as such shows that minority racial groups are more likely to experience multi-generational poverty than their white counterparts. So they're more likely to be born into families that have, maybe had generations of poverty before them. Racist attitudes have also influenced all aspects of life, which created the inequalities that led to poverty. So, the racist attitudes essentially were the precursor to a lot of the racist systems and the inequalities that we have now, because the racist ideologies were essentially the foundation for some of these policies and practices. Sadly, these inequalities and inequities are increasing globally. Poverty is often discussed as if it's one-dimensional, as if poverty affects everyone the same way, and that's completely inaccurate. Again, poverty is multidimensional. It is characterized by multiple physical and psychological factors such as educational attainment, income, and overall health. Children who live in poverty generally have poorer health and social outcomes, including higher rates of morbidity and chronic diseases, reduced achievement, and more problems associated with emotions and behavior. For example, research has shown that in the United States, about 72 Black children are arrested for drug crimes, 86 are arrested for violent crimes, and around 760 or so high school students drop out, and a little over 4,500 public school students are suspended. As the income and wealth gaps continue to expand and the cost of raising children increases, American families, especially American families of color, can't keep up. Black, Hispanic, or Latino, and American Indian or Alaskan Indian families' earnings are nearly half of what white and Asian/Pacific Islander families earn. In 2021, the Black family's median income lagged 11.62% behind the national average. From 1979 to 2019, so that was literally right before COVID, income inequality in the United States grew by 25%. Income and wealth gaps continue to harm low-income families and families of color. This inequality is certainly not accidental, as there are racist housing policies, like redlining, like zoning laws, right? Employment discrimination, so looking at, the income gap, by and wealth gap, and the wages that a person of color versus their white counterpart get, right? Um, and unequal access to quality education and healthcare. The income and wealth gap are making it very difficult to afford necessities and nearly impossible to build wealth. The minimum wage does not allow families to support their children without additional support, right? So then we go into some of those impoverished stereotypes that a lot of people of color are subjected to. So, welfare queen stereotypes and things of that nature, right? This negative connotation with government aid and things like that. So that's, for many, some of the additional support, and some of them may venture into things like loans, which, if you don't have like good credit, for example, you're gonna have incredibly high interest rates, or borrowing from other people. So it certainly is not ideal for many Black families to have to, you know, borrow or anything like that. And then also just having to potentially depend on government aid, and also working because your wages can't afford your living expenses, not because you live above your means, but because of the severe wage gap for workers of color. American policies and systems harbor a long and, currently living history of excluding families of color from opportunities to build wealth. Racist housing policies like redlining, employment discrimination, the severe wage gap, the unequal access to quality education, and childcare have all contributed to America's income and wealth inequality. Now we're gonna dive into poverty-induced stress and its effects, and we'll look at the psychological and developmental impact first. The stress of living in poverty has been shown to stunt child development, which can affect them for a lifetime. Many children experience stress associated with poverty before birth when they're in the womb. So they are essentially predisposed to having a predisposed to being essentially kind of born with barriers and disadvantages. Data has shown that African Americans have the highest infant mortality rate. African American mothers are 2.2 times more likely to birth low birth weight infants than their white counterparts. Low median family income is also negatively correlated with preterm birth and low birth weight. Preterm and low birth weight can negatively affect brain and body development. So the lower the median income, the more at risk a person is to experience stressors such as inadequate health and educational services, being exposed to environmental toxins, and even violence. When children's stress response systems remain activated at high levels for long periods of time, for example, in utero, so the mom is stressed and her body releases stress hormones, and the baby is then exposed to stress hormones. When those systems and those hormones are activated at high levels for long periods, it can have a significant wear and tear effect on their developing brains and other biological systems. This can have lifelong effects on learning, behavior, and both physical and mental health. More recent research has shown that suicide rates among Black children and adolescents are rising dramatically, even though overall youth suicidality is declining. So even though there are less children and youth um, expressing suicidality um, and killing or harming themselves, the suicide rates among the Black children and adolescents is and continues to rise dramatically. Evidence shows that the fetus is very sensitive to indicators of maternal stress, such as hormones, and that heightened exposure in the prenatal period can lead to heightened stress after birth and long-term problems such as emotional and cognitive functioning. Mothers who live in high stress situations, especially women living in poverty, affect the development of their unborn children, as if they are constantly experiencing stress, the baby is also experiencing stress, and that can impact their development, which can impact their achievement and affect them for the rest of their lives, possibly. So just remember your ACEs, right? So research has shown that individuals of lower SES are exposed to higher rates of change or um, that they are exposed to higher rates of change or instability, producing higher levels of individual distress. These factors may explain why pregnant women living under these conditions have overactive stress response systems and thereby influence their offspring's developmental path. One of the one of the most striking quotes I found in my research while doing this was that Black children may be born into systems where they could have 3 or more ACEs starting at birth, which is incredibly frightening because we know that even one ACE increases a person's risk of depression. And an individual who experiences 7 ACEs is 51 times more likely to end their life. For a Black child to already be born with 3 or more ACEs and, at birth is frightening because that means they are at very high risk um, of experiencing such negative effects of, at some point possibly experiencing depression or ending their lives and, susceptible to so many, negative things in their lives. Children and young people with multiple ACEs often struggle with emotional regulation, anger, and executive functioning. Because of systematic racism and ongoing bias, rather than receiving treatment for their trauma and mental health conditions, Black children are often labeled as problems. One of the things I think about is in school, right? So as early as preschool, children of color are disciplined at twice the rate of white children. In elementary and high school, Black students are 3 times as likely to be expelled and 4 times as likely to face multiple suspensions. So the children can experience stress in utero, and then as they grow, they may have issues with emotional regulation, executive functioning, anger, things of that nature, trauma, mental health conditions, all of these things, right? And in schools and in society, by police, and all of these institutions, um, instead of receiving treatment, they are labeled as problems and punished, essentially. Data has shown that 1 in 4 children meet lifetime criteria for a mental health disorder. Previous research provides evidence of internalizing disorders, so like depressive and anxiety disorders, for example, as early as infancy. And early symptoms tend to persist into childhood and adolescence. That's frightening. That infants can experience these types of disorders. And, if you think of, an infant in distress, right? So they may cry, they may whine, and all of those things, right? Is that, how they display their depressive and anxiety symptoms and things like that, right? Like, to imagine that a baby or that a very young child can experience disorders like this so early in life is frightening, quite frankly. There was a meta-analysis on racial discrimination and mental health that indicated that personal discrimination was associated with less sense of control, self-esteem, life satisfaction, and increased psychological distress, depression symptoms, and anxiety symptoms. There are also many brain development impacts. So prenatal stress induced by poverty has been shown to also have a negative effect on brain development. There's been some research done on the effects of stress in areas of the brain like the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and the amygdala, which we'll get right into next. The prefrontal cortex. So this is the area of the brain that's responsible for higher thinking and executive function, including planning, working, memory, attention, problem solving, verbal reasoning, inhibition, and monitoring actions. Reduced connections between the neurons in the brain reduce the prefrontal cortex's ability to regulate those functions. It has been found that brain regions of prenatally stressed children are less connected than those who didn't experience toxic stress and may lack the ability to do cognitive processes. From this, we can deduce that reduced neuron connections can cause reduced attention, memory, and emotional regulation and behavior. And this makes me think a little bit about how many of our Black children, specifically our Black boys, are, in behavioral classes or are diagnosed with ADHD at such a young age, right? So is it ADHD? Is it behavior problem? Or does it really kind of stem from toxic stress that is causing some of the dysregulation with, their memory, their attention, their emotional regulation, and their behavior, right? The hippocampus. So this is the part of the brain that is important for learning and memory. Neurogenesis, so that is the birth of neurons in the hippocampus, continues throughout life and contributes to learning. Acute stress during gestation can result in reduced hippocampal volume and inhibition of neurogenesis. So this can essentially decrease or even stop the birth of neurons. Excessive levels of glucocorticoids in the hippocampus prenatally also can produce toxic alterations to neurons. So not only is there a possibility that it could inhibit neurogenesis, but the neurons that are there can be altered in a negative way. Research demonstrates poverty to be related to the size of the hippocampus. Hippocampal gray matter, which is the neuronal cell bodies, is associated with SES, as children from lower SES backgrounds had less hippocampal gray matter than children from more affluent backgrounds. So what that tells me is that that Black children and children that are from a lower SES background may just be predisposed to having issues with learning and memory, starting as early as in utero. Environmental stimulation and parental nurturance, so those are also associated with income level, to be related to memory, which is largely mediated by the hippocampus as well. So the environmental stimulation and parental nurturance can honestly vary, right? So folks from a lower SES background, they may have parents that have to work several jobs to make ends meet, right? So they may not be able to give them that attention to be able to do extra learning in the home as much as their affluent counterparts. The last area of the brain that we'll discuss is the amygdala. The amygdala plays an essential role in processing memory and emotion, notably fear. Research has been done on rats who have similarly structured brains to humans, and it found that prenatal stress-exposed rats had an expanded nucleus of the amygdala, which is an area where learned fear is encoded. These developmental differences may predispose animals exposed to fear-related behaviors, manifesting in anxiety-like symptoms. Experiencing excess stress during the prenatal period can be toxic to an unborn child. The more a child is exposed to stress, the more the brain development can negatively be affected. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the impact on health outcomes. We have just a couple of facts here before we start getting into some other specific health details. Black and brown children are more likely to grow up in underserved neighborhoods. These children are more likely to be exposed to air particles that increase their risk of asthma. They are at greater risk of brain and nerve damage from exposure to lead in their homes. They are more likely to have limited food choices and diets of highly processed foods that increase a child's risk of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. Many of the underserved neighborhoods are also food deserts, so they don't have food options for the most part, other than some of our fast food options, right? I think of some of our underserved neighborhoods where I live, and they have an excessive amount of liquor stores and fast food restaurants, for example, and not so much options for fresh fruit and vegetables, or supermarket options and things like that. They typically have to go outside of their neighborhood to have access to those things. According to research, 1 in 5 U.S. children and adolescents have obesity. 24.8% of non-Hispanic Black children are obese. Lack of access to healthcare has been cited as one of the reasons children of color are less likely to survive childhood cancer. And again, there is a lack of access to quality education. The effects of the discrimination that people of color experience combined with these stresses of living in poverty create potentially toxic levels of stress that result in poorer pregnancy outcomes and early onset health problems for children. Communicable diseases and mortality. Poverty can contribute to many communicable diseases, including many acute and chronic infectious diseases. So that includes STDs and STIs, HIV and AIDS, hepatitis, flu. Um, Poverty and the associated disadvantage of personal and social resources often lead to unsafe habitation and lack of cleanliness, unhealthy diets, and malnutrition. And this includes maternal and fetal um, malnutrition, diets, cleanliness, and habitation as well. They also have poor water quality, increased exposure to infectious diseases, environmental pollution, and toxins. Mortality inequity was linked to 6 leading causes of preventable excess deaths for the Black population compared to the white population. Those included cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, infant mortality, chemical dependency, and homicide or intentional injury. The rates of infectious disease, morbidity, and mortality in low resource households, communities, and nations over decades bear witness to the considerable impact of economic inequality on health. Now I want to talk about maternal and child health. Poverty has been strongly linked with poor reproductive outcomes, both independently and in combination with exposure to discrimination. African American mothers are, again, affected by poverty-induced stress and the stress of living in a racist society. So it's twofold for them. Maternal and child health among low-income and racial / ethnic minority groups are particularly susceptible to psychological stress, nutrition, substance use, and more. There's a term called weathering, which is what I mentioned earlier, which explains that African Americans experience early health deterioration as a result of the cumulative impact of repeated social or economic adversity and political marginalization. So it's a wear and tear, essentially, on the body, on, mental health that causes the population to potentially experience early health deterioration. This early health deterioration in utero puts Black children at a disadvantage before they are even born. The stress associated with living in a racist society that stigmatizes and disadvantages African Americans causes disproportionate early physiological decline. A higher child poverty rate, for example, and lower immunization rates, higher health expenditure per capita because if they are sicker, then they have to spend more money to try to get better, right? And the absence of universal childcare. So those are just some of the factors in high child mortality in the United States. There's also a heightened risk of violence in impoverished neighborhoods. Research has shown that in impoverished neighborhoods, there is a increased risk of violence due to proximity. Being in an impoverished neighborhood, some people may feel like that's their only way to be able to, survive. Some people that may live in that neighborhood may also have experienced, right, the effects of poverty and racism in utero, and now they are kind of acting in a way because they have negatively been affected in their early development, unfortunately. In addition to that, there is also increased violence from like police, for example, in some of these communities. So increased police presence, increased police violence, things of that nature. Incarcerated youth. Globally and in the United States, incarceration rates are higher among poor and marginalized groups. High risk of violence, rape, and sexual assault, sexually transmitted diseases, substance use disorders, mental illnesses, and physical disorders. For children within the criminal justice system or otherwise deprived of liberty, they're particularly high risk to experience these things, unfortunately. And for many, it will they may be high risk to these things throughout their lives. Adult incarceration can create health deficits in familial youth. The discriminatory incarceration of African American parents, especially fathers, lowers their child's performance. We can reasonably infer that our criminal justice system contributes to the black-white achievement gap in both cognitive and non-cognitive skills. African American children are also 6 times as likely as white children to have had an imprisoned parent. Although young African American men are no more likely to use or sell drugs than young white men, young African American men are nearly 3 times as likely as white men to be arrested for drug use or sale. Once arrested, they are more likely to be sentenced, and once sentenced, their jail and prison terms are typically 50% higher than their white counterparts. And when they do get out, then they face stigma, revoked rights, and diminished job opportunities. And, then they feel like they have to turn back into, crime, violence, things of that nature, right? Because the cycle of violence, which is the picture I have here, essentially, they do something, they get in trouble for it, and then they end up in the justice system, and then they have this increased dependence on crime. And then when you get out and face, stigma, revoked rights, and, not many job opportunities, it just keeps repeating in this vicious cycle. Chronic non-communicable diseases. Patterns of disparities negatively are observed in the incidence of prevalence of in the incidence and prevalence of chronic diseases like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, kidney disease, and obesity. So the indirect implications for health, they are also, race-based disadvantages. So race-based disadvantages can influence other social determinants as the intersection with poverty can further limit um, um, housing, educational, and employment opportunities, and those also have been linked to worse health outcomes. So one of the things that I do want to talk about here is this surviving versus thriving, right? So relative and absolute economic deprivation can shape expectations and perceived life chances in a manner that individuals focus on surviving rather than thriving. So being in that fight or flight mode, right? Um, and constantly being in that fight or flight mode can be detrimental to your physical and mental health. All right, so we are getting close to the end here. So just a couple of thoughts from me about future research. There certainly is a need for more research on the topic. Um, it certainly is interdisciplinary, um, but it's needed to fully understand what's going on, because this is a public health crisis, quite frankly. We certainly need to gather data from Black families and their children to evaluate other long-term health issues that may develop, and perhaps follow them through their lives to see if things are exacerbated, or maybe there are other health issues um, that they have later on in life. We also need to gather more information on African American mothers during pregnancy and after pregnancy, evaluating their health and the baby's health over time. For this, it certainly would be a interdisciplinary longitudinal study that would likely be the most beneficial to be able to get quality data. In conclusion, poverty and racism have been proven to directly affect Black families and therefore their children. In order to get children of color out of poverty and to prevent more children from experiencing poverty, we have to help their families, we have to help their unit. And part of that would be to continue to advocate for structural and systematic changes. That's going to be pretty much the only way that we'll be able to create long-lasting changes that can create equity for Black and brown children. Black children are disproportionately predisposed to the negative effects of racism and poverty before birth. I have many references. These have all been really interesting, and they have so much data that is fascinating, while also being very discouraging a little bit. Thank you for sitting through my presentation.
I hope you enjoyed this continuing education course from Agents of Change. Want to earn your CE credits for this course? Visit agentsofchangetraining.com or the link in the description to purchase the course and take the post-test. If you're looking for more CEs, check out our unlimited plan. You will get unlimited access to 150 plus ASWB and NBCC approved continuing education courses for one low annual fee. We're always adding new courses. Did I mention we also have 5 free CE credits available too? Check it out at agentsofchangetraining.com.